The Visigothic period, in particular the period after Recared's conversion to Catholicism in the year 587, is like one of the most bizarre periods of Jewish history that I have to say I've ever studied. It's extremely difficult to tease out some of the methodological issues, and just the content of this history is bizarre beyond belief. Here's a map that gives us a sense of where the Visigothic kingdom was located. You see the capital there in Toulouse, and it occupies much of the Iberian Peninsula and over into what would be southern France, right up around the Rhone River and so on. And they invaded in the 5th century. And initially, the Jews that were located in this area probably fared fairly well because the Visigoths were originally Arian. And what I mean by that is they followed Bishop Arius, Arius, not Arys, hence the term Aryan with an I. Nothing to do with, Aryan nations or Nazism or anything like that, obviously. But this particular bishop had a vision of Christianity, which was somewhat distinct from Catholicism, particularly with regards to the figure of Jesus and his relationship to divinity. This is something that is really significant for the early church trying to exactly figure out, was Jesus God? Was Jesus human? If there's a spectrum between those things, how does that work? It's really beyond me and certainly beyond the scope of what we're discussing. But for the relevance of the Visigothic period, the school of Arius had a much more human leaning towards the interpretation of the figure of Jesus, and this was declared a heresy by the Catholic Church. So when Recared converted to Catholicism from Arianism in the year 587, this marked the beginning of the truly bizarre era in Visigothic Jewish relations. Let's just have a look at this remarkable work of art that I had in the cover screen here. This is Antonio Munoz de Grain, the conversion of Recared. And as you can see, Recared is obviously in the center there. He's got this heavenward gaze, and he's obviously entranced by his spiritual, transformation. And he's got his hand on the Bible there. It's being held up dutifully by some kind of church official. Really powerful image, I have to say. And I think it captures the kind of excitement that must have gone along with this conversion. And at this point, I think it's significant for us to sort of reflect on the concept of the zeal of the convert. Many of us, are in regular commerce with converts in our various religious communities, and they're wonderful people in many ways, but one of the fascinating aspects of converts is they often tend to take on more religious observance than people who were born into that faith community. I think we can say this, by the way, not only about religious conversion, but I think you could say it about political conversion to different political parties, things like that. At any rate, in this context, we often find that converts, in the Jewish community, they will be say something like, excuse me, isn't that lashon hara? Isn't that forbidden speech? And don't you have to say a special bracha, a special blessing after you eat 2 pieces of pizza? All kinds of things like that that may irritate Jews who are raised in a tradition, because the converts are actually spurring them on to take on additional responsibilities, or at least recognize responsibilities they may already have. In this particular context of the Visigothic era, one of the unfortunately tried and true methods of demonstrating one's zeal for Catholicism in the medieval period is to show just how anti-Jewish you can be. And so what happens in the Visigothic era is that there's a whole series of kings, and we have a very good set of their rules and regulations that were passed over the course of the next century and a bit. There's like an incredible degree of anti-Jewish regulations that are stunning in their capacity, in their scope, and in many ways they anticipate the kind of anti-Jewish persecution that we'll only see 700 odd years later in the Inquisition. and to a certain degree, even in the 20th century. I'm going to walk you through some of these things, but there are also some methodological problems that we have to consider. And one of the most important ones is that we have an absence of Jewish records that correspond to this period. In other words, the Jewish community in Spain was still too small, too weak, too undeveloped perhaps, or for whatever reasons. We are talking about, this is 1400 odd years ago. The records never survived. We just don't know how the Jewish community would have reacted to these legislations. And it's even possible that in the absence of any kind of secondary perspective on the period, that it could have been a legal fiction. In other words, it doesn't cost very much to simply put a law on the books. And if you want to demonstrate your bona fides, literally your good faith, you could easily put in an anti-Jewish piece of legislation that doesn't have any correspondence to reality because there may not be any Jews who are affected by it. It's hard to imagine that these laws were completely fictional, but on the other hand, it's also difficult to imagine that all of them were actually imposed, and in some cases, the imposition was a logical impossibility. That is, for example, once you have forcibly baptized all the Jews, how do you go and forcibly baptize the Jews again 20 years later, which is the kind of thing that we see in this period? Either you have to redefine, either you have a new influx of Jews into the region, not impossible, or you have like open Judaizing with Jews abandoning the forcible conversion, also not impossible, or you have a new definition of what a baptized individual is, and that's also not impossible. Let's go through some of those scenarios. But first, I think it's important that we actually look at the kind of persecutory legislation that was imposed in this Visigothic period. So you recall, once again, that the period we're talking about is basically from 587, when we have this conversion to Catholicism on the part of the Visigothic kings, until 711 with the Muslim invasion. Here's a remarkable image that captures, I think, very brilliantly the sort of atmosphere that I get in my mind when I think of these Visigothic kings. This is Alonso Cano's 17th century Kings of the Visigoths. I wonder if there's a certain bit of art history here that I don't know much about. I'd like to do a little more research on it, because they don't look like 6th, 7th, 8th century kings to me. They look a little bit too modern, maybe Renaissance era, maybe even later, maybe the fashion and things like that. I'm not sure. But the expressions are perfect. Like the impression I get of these Visigothic kings from Alonso Cano's work is spot on. Let's try and understand some of those regulations. So, as I mentioned, one of the most common things that we see in the Visigothic law books is a series of forced conversions of Jews, which caused a certain amount of stir beyond the Visigothic era. The church, the higher church, never openly approved of forcibly converting Jews, and depending on the era in which we're studying, there is more, disclaimers or more discouragement of local kings to do this. But on the other hand, the church really had difficulty dealing with the ex post facto situation. What do you do with Jews who are forcibly converted and in so doing partook of the sacraments, including, for example, baptism? Can you simply ignore that and say, no, they're actually Jews, it doesn't count, do over? Or do you have to say, well, you know what, it shouldn't have happened, but now they're in fact Christians? So we have this situation where in the Visigothic period, and again, think of the echoes to the Inquisition that we'll discuss later on in this course, the Jews are forcibly converted, and then they're charged with Judaizing, meaning of going back to their Jewish ideas and especially practices. This occurs several times over the course of the next century. One possible way to understand this cycle is it seems that the Visigoths may have created a new Christian status, which is something that we will see explicitly with the Inquisition period almost a millennium later, that the Jews are made Christians through baptism, but then they're not really trusted. That they have a new Christian status, which distinguishes them from the old Christians, meaning they're not quite reliable in their Christian bona fides. Hence, they could be once again forcibly converted. They could be once again persecuted, identified, and ostracized in various ways. Now, here's some of the bizarre elements of it. The Visigoths, in their zeal to really root out Judaizing, put in place legislation that specifically banned, for example, Jews from traveling to different locations for their festivals. And if travel was permitted, they literally had to check in with local church officials on their route and to ensure that they would not be engaging in any secret Jewish practice. This is a level of reach and interference into daily life that is wholly modern in concept. Like the idea of actually tracking people's movements with kind of like a 7th, 8th century GPS. It's so bizarre, but nevertheless, that's the kind of thing that they were demanding, that Jews had to like regularly check in with Christian officials to make sure that these Jews who now are Christians are not actually going back to Jewish practice. Again, it really seems like way out of context for much of the anti-Jewish legislation that we won't see for a long time. And the punishments were, oh my gosh, way over the top in comparison to the kinds of things we see elsewhere. One punishment, which was apparently meted out even to children, was something called decalvatio, which is, it could mean one of two things. It could either mean an embarrassing kind of very short haircut. We all know what that's like, especially if we're teenagers, right? That someone who was accused of a fairly minor crime, like maybe refraining from work on Saturday, which is kind of like a passive crime in this context, and they might receive this decalvatio as like a being shorn of their hair, might be especially embarrassing for a woman, and then, you know, to have to walk around and people would identify them that way, at least temporarily. But it could also mean scalping. I mean, literally carving the top layer of skin off a person's head, you know, like in the American Wild West. And that would be a devastating kind of punishment, especially for children, if you can imagine it. Um, it's possible to imagine that that is in fact what they meant by decalvatio, especially when you look at some of the other punishments. So one of the more serious charges was a marital relationship between a Jew and a non-Jew. Once again, remember that that term Jew might actually refer to a new Christian, perhaps, in which case the male partner would have his sexual organ amputated. Like, wow. And the female partner would have her nose amputated. Horrific kind of punishments. You know, these do sound like kind of Visigothic in nature, like the Dark Ages had a lot of really bizarre punishments like this, but nevertheless, you see this the scope and reach of these punishments is mind-boggling. There are repeated confiscations of wealth and repeated expulsions. Like all Jews have to leave Visigothic kingdom, and then 20 years later, all Jews have to leave the Visigothic kingdom. So once again, how do you do that twice? Does that mean that there were Jews who came back to the region? We do have examples of this in the medieval period. France, for example, expels its Jews 3 times in, I think it was the 14th century, maybe the 13th century. And then they're re-invited again. Yeah, it would be the 14th century. They're re-invited back in. So did that happen and we just don't have a record of them being invited in? Or perhaps these are just simply fictional laws that are stated in order to kind of like, you know, show whoever reads these laws that in fact they are adequately persecuting their Jews. Again, the methodological problem is that we don't have the reaction of the Jews. If we had some documentation from the Jewish community suggesting that they were protesting or that they were hiding or they were dissimulating, then that would validate the laws as in being something that was actually practiced, but otherwise we only have this legal text and we don't know how much it corresponds to reality on the ground. We do have some sense of it based on how the Jews would later react to the fall of the Visigothic Empire. Let's turn to that in just a minute. First of all, I want to point out that this brief period, right, from 587 to 711, is one of those strange kind of moments in which we only have one little kind of pinprick view of history, and it is, incredibly dense with text, but absent other perspectives, it's hard to know what the big picture is. But I'm hardly the only person to comment on the so-called rhyme of history, that a lot of the elements that we're seeing in the Visigothic period would later be expressed, especially in the Iberian Peninsula, especially in the era of the Inquisition. One of the more famous people who thought about this was Baron de Montesquieu, very important 18th century thinker, who wrote, as you see here, tous les maximes, tous les principes, et tous les vues de l'Inquisition. When he was referring to the Visigothic era, he said this is all like completely mirrored in the kind of ideas and activities of the Inquisition, which is phenomenal. But we can even go beyond this. We see elements of it like this idea of limpieza de sangre, the so-called purity of the blood, which was exactly mirrored in the Inquisition era, where Jews were forcibly converted, and then they were given this label of new Christians, and there was kind of this coalescing of thought around the idea that the Jews were somehow racially distinct from the Christian population. And this is out of step with a lot of the medieval world, in the sense that conversion was basically, that was it. Once you had converted to this new community, once you had adopted this new community identity, then you were essentially absorbed into it. Let's remember that the concept of racism really doesn't develop until the 19th century. There is color bias, to be sure, and there is, like cultural bias, linguistic bias, things like that. But generally speaking, conversion meant open doors to the new society in which one entered. So here the idea of the purity of the blood meant that you had one group of societal members based on their descent, on their ancestry, and another group who belonged to the same faith but were of a different ancestry and therefore were somehow legally shunted aside. So that's something we see in the Visigothic era, possibly, but we certainly see it in the Inquisition era. And one last thing, one of the more brilliant early scholars of the Holocaust was someone named Dr. Raoul Hilberg, who wrote this massive 3-volume work, an early work really delving into the Nazi bureaucratic text. It's called The Destruction of the European Jews. And he specifically looked to the Inquisition era as a straight line from the 15th century right up to the 20th century. And when I first read that, I didn't know as much as I do now about the Inquisition era, and I thought, oh, come on, please, that's like looking at history backwards, and I really doubted it. But now I'm feeling that, you know what, there really is a lot of symmetry between some of the thinking of the Inquisition and the Holocaust, specifically the ideas I mentioned earlier, and also the incipient totalitarianism that we see in this era. The idea that the state can really reach so deeply into the private lives of citizens, something which we do not see really happening until, let's say, the 18th, 19th century at all in Europe, and especially in the 20th century, that requires modern technology, modern communication, record keeping that can be distributed over a large geographic area. These kinds of things really aren't possible in the Visigothic era, but in fact we see them at least making the attempts in the Visigothic law codes. So it's a terrifying thing to think about this as being the roots of something that would only mature in its darkest form in the 20th century, but nevertheless I think it's worth contemplating. This all comes to a dramatic conclusion in the year 711. With the Muslim invasion of the peninsula, you can see in this map here, coming up from the south, and with remarkable speed and power, the Muslims completely dismantle the Visigothic state and begin a new era for the peninsula. Now, the Jewish reaction to the Muslim invasion is complex, but on the whole, they were definitely pleased to see the Muslims. There's a certain amount of debate, which I hope to engage in when we come back to the peninsula, as to how much Jews were involved with the early Muslim invaders. There is a historiographic tendency to portray the Jews as traitors of the Christian nation. And there is another historiographic tendency which argues that they may not have actively abetted their entry, but once they were there, they saw it as a very positive development for them. I tend to lean towards the second interpretation, but let's get to that when we get to that particular period. At any rate, this is kind of like a backwards reflection on how the Jews must have reacted to the law codes of the Visigoths, and it was entirely unsurprising to assume that they would have welcomed the Muslims quite actively, given the level of persecution that they experienced under the Visigoths. Okay, let us continue our discussion with the beginnings of Islam in the Arabian Peninsula, and it's a fascinating discussion to be sure. I'm looking forward to speaking with you again in the future. Thanks very much for watching.